This video is about suggestions for video game designers. A while back I made a video where I criticized game mechanics, especially level mechanics. Video over there. I did have some suggestions in that video as well, but mostly it was about what I consider to be mistakes in game design. This time I am going to be talking about things I suggest video game designers would use in their games. And in future videos I will be talking about role-playing games, their rules and tips for game masters. But those will be separate videos, so this is just about video games. I have about 20 different suggestions here, which I will go over in no particular order. The first is one that could be used in any FPS game and possibly others as well, but I am thinking mostly about games where you fight perhaps against other players, perhaps against AI in the solo version of the game, but the idea is internal bleeding in a very simple way. So the idea is to use this in addition to normal surface bleeding. The idea is that when you get critical hits of some kind, depending of course on the game, when you get these more serious hits, then you also get internal bleeding that requires better healing than regular first aid or whatever you have in that game. So in a small, short, single map, there's no time for anything other than just first aid essentially. But possibly if this is some kind of a campaign structured thing, there will be missions one after the other, and so between these missions you can be expected to get proper treatment, and so what you need to do is just survive the scenario, the map, and you can continue on to the next one. But the way I figured this internal bleeding could work is simply that you get a little bit of damage over time which cannot be healed. So you constantly get a little bit of damage, and if you just manage to survive to the end of the thing, the map, scenario, whatever, then fine, you made it. But this would force you to play the map rather quickly, I suppose. That's my first suggestion. The other is similar or related to injuries anyway. And there is something similar in some games, like actually in the early Rainbow Six games, for example. The idea is lasting injuries. So if, like in Rainbow Six, you have a campaign made of discrete scenarios, you can get injured seriously, incapacitated, and that means you're out of action and you won't be able to do anything really until you are healed from that. And the idea is that you can slowly heal these injuries, and that requires rest, and it also means that while you are injured you get some penalties. It's not as easy for you to move, shoot, climb, whatever. The point is that dying is not the only way to be taken out during a mission. You can also be just injured so that you are out for probably like the next scenario, map, whatever. This of course assumes that there are more than one character like there actually is in Rainbow Six, which is something that is sometimes used, I suppose, but not enough. A lot of games are focused around just one character, and I guess it makes sense a lot of the time, but in some games you might have several different characters that you play, or even very similar to the old Rainbow Six games. Then I have some suggestions about stealth, about the guards or other people. These guards, or people in general, should only pay attention to unusual sounds. Usually in stealth games they react to any sound that one of them is not making, which is kind of weird, because how would they know that the sound was not made by one of their own? So the idea is that, for example, the sound of footsteps should in many places seem normal, but for example the sound of running, and especially of hitting objects, accidentally running into a table and causing plates to fall on the ground or whatever. That sort of noise obviously is not normal. That would be unusual, and that would be something that would alert guards or even just people in general to at least, check out what's going on. Does someone need help or whatever? Related to this is that in a lot of stealth games there are easy ways to silently take out guards, which makes sense because that's the point in a lot of these games, but it's actually pretty difficult to really do it quietly, silently, without any noise especially. So it should be possible, perhaps at least in some situations, for the guards to intentionally make some additional noise when they are being taken out. So that could be something that could be used. In some games, unfortunately, it seems that the guards have some kind of telepathic connection, because when one is alerted, they are all alerted, and that is dumb. For example, Sniper Elite games don't make this mistake. They are better designed, so the guards actually need to inform or make noise so that the other guards will understand that something is going on. And that is what all games basically should do, unless they actually are somehow telepathically connected to each other or have some kind of cyber link or whatever, or they are robotic or whatever. I already mentioned in that earlier video that it's kind of dumb that the guards typically don't realize that people like other guards are disappearing from around them, except for Sniper Elite games again, where they actually sometimes seem to notice that something is going on. And that is obviously how it should be. The guards, when they notice the other guards are disappearing, they should not just look for these other guards, but they could also change their own paths, because they of course have these paths that all these guards constantly keep on walking. But when they realize that some guards are missing, it makes sense that they have to change the paths that they have to be now patrolling, because there are guards missing. Somebody has to take care of those other areas as well. And at least if they realize that more than one guard is missing, it might affect their choices even more. They could get scared because they realize that things are now getting a bit spooky. So they might seek help, they might go alert other guards, for example at barracks somewhere, or they could just retreat to better, safer areas because they realize that they are in some kind of danger, probably, because if 3 of their 4 friends have gone missing, it's likely that they are gonna be next. There are typically officers or different kinds of soldiers in these games, and especially if you think about military games, there are officers who have some tasks, for example making sure that the guards who are their underlings are doing what they are supposed to be doing. So there should be various levels of different officers who sometimes check on their guards, and if they find that some guards are missing, they should call for reinforcements or alert the higher-ups. Then about the AI used in all kinds of shooting or combat games and stealth games. I already mentioned in the previous video something about the psychology that is kind of missing from those games, but what I didn't mention is that most people, soldiers included, don't actually want to kill, to fight. And it's not just because they are afraid of fighting, but they actually just don't want to kill. That's a normal human thing. So it would be nice to see at least a nod toward this fact sometimes in games. So for example, some enemy might try to avoid fighting the player character. They might even pretend they didn't see the player character. Also, it might be a good idea to have this psychological phenomenon affect the player character as well. So when you, for example, try to shoot at actual people, the mechanics of the game might make it more difficult for you to actually point the gun toward a living person. You might, for example, go to a range in the game, that is, and find it easy to shoot at the targets. But then when you try to shoot at an actual living person, you might find that your hand is shaking, and it's not that easy then to actually try to kill someone. It might actually be easier for you to shoot them at their legs, for example. It's something that games these days should be able to do. We have the computing power for that, right? Also, assuming, of course, as is likely to be the case in the game, that you do actually shoot and kill someone, this could have other effects, like in horror games like those based on Call of Cthulhu, for example, the game that is. You might have something like sanity points, and when you actually intentionally kill someone, or even if you kill someone unintentionally, you might lose sanity points, or you might have some kind of sanity mechanics otherwise in the game. You get the point. If the game is a long campaign like Fallout 4, for example, you might even have something like lasting effects from killing, like you might see nightmares and might not be able to rest effectively and things like that, which would in a way reward playing a nice guy who doesn't kill others. That's at least something to think about. I mentioned in that earlier video that it's kind of annoying that sometimes in games you just can't cross some obstacle, you can't climb over a fallen tree or something, which is weird when you can do other athletic stuff in the game. Instead of just having one way to clear an obstacle, get over an obstacle, for example, you might also have a slower way to do that, so that you can actually get over that fallen tree, but it might take a little bit more time and it might cause some noise, which again might alert guards nearby if they are really nearby. If the game is a science fiction game, or a game where the setting is space out there in some way, it would be nice if then, for example, the space itself were represented more realistically than usually happens. Especially the lack of gravity and the lack of sound, the extreme temperatures and radiation, things like these. Like in the good part of the movie 2001 Space Odyssey. In the game Prey, the player character at some point can use some kind of a jetpack or spacewalk suit or something, and it would be nice if that sort of thing would have a limitation based on the amount of fuel, so you'd have to ration how much fuel you use. When I played the game, I actually thought that was the case, which made the game a lot more scary and a lot more realistic, I suppose, for me, until I realized that nope, there is no limitation to the amount of fuel. So yeah, it still is a great game, by the way, but anyway, it would be nice, a nice addition if you could also have this limitation to the amount of fuel you use. So you might have to refuel the thing sometimes and just blast yourself one direction and then hope that the inertia would take you to wherever it is you try to go. FPS games at least used to have this ridiculous jumping thing where you can just jump up and down all the time. I think you probably know what I'm talking about. That's really annoying, really unrealistic. I don't want to remove jumping altogether. It is pretty useful to have the option to jump, but You can make it more realistic by having it cause fatigue and by making it difficult to aim or even impossible to aim while jumping, while in the air. That would be nice. Also in FPS games, there should always be some amount of like inherent inaccuracy in shooting. The player can of course easily use the mouse to point the gun wherever they want and just hold it there, but it's not that easy to do in real life. So depending on your stance, for example, if you are prone with a bipod, for example, it's obviously a lot easier to keep your weapon pointed at your target, but otherwise there's going to be some swaying, and when you pull the trigger then there is movement in the gun, and all these things, they mean that depending on how good you are, there is some amount of inaccuracy always. So these are something to include in the game. Like in Sniper Elite, breathing and even pulse actually matter, which is nice for a sniping game, but could be used probably in other games as well. And you could have various skills for shooting as well, so you could become a better shooter, so your inherent inaccuracy would be reduced. Obviously, running and shooting should always be difficult to do. I mean, to shoot accurately, that is. Of course, you can pull the trigger, that's not the issue. Also, the psychological effect of receiving fire. So, it's one thing to shoot at the target, another to shoot at a living person in order to intend to kill them, and it's yet another thing to try and shoot at someone while you are being shot at, and maybe explosions are going around and things are very stressful and scary. These could also affect your skill in shooting, your inherent inaccuracy, for example. You probably have noticed, if you played at least any fairly recent games, FPS games for example, where there are enemy snipers, there is this glint coming off their scopes that is ridiculously noticeable, and it would be nice to at least have the option to remove this glint and to not notice those snipers that easily. It would make the game more difficult but also more realistic. Having options for the player to choose from, that would be in general a very good thing in my opinion. Games involving things like throwing knives or shuriken usually depict those weapons as deadly, which is kind of inaccurate. Even assuming the kind of skill that it requires to throw a knife and hit the right way, it is still not that deadly usually. I mean, it's possible to kill someone that way, but it's very unlikely. The way they have been used in reality is to just throw them as a distraction to enable you to make a more effective attack or try something else. For example, one of the best movies ever, Yojimbo, shows one way to use a throwing knife. You might want to see that movie. In general, I think injuries should affect the player character. That means it also should matter where you have been hit. In these games, usually, no matter how you get damage, you just get abstract damage, and then there is a specific animation that you do when you heal. Just put on a band-aid or something. And that's okay, I suppose, but it could be better. You could have it matter where you get hit. So if you get hit in the legs, for example, and this has been done in some games, like again, I think in Rainbow Six games you already had something like this. And in Sniper Elite games you have something like this. So if you get hit in a leg, it's more difficult for you to run and maybe climb. And if you get hit in an arm, then it's difficult or impossible for you to use a rifle or things like that until you get that healed at least. One last suggestion, a new mechanic I haven't seen anywhere. Reputation, essentially. So in many games you play a character who in one way or another passes through various scenarios, and it's possible that you even kill hundreds of enemies in each of those scenarios, and you would think that you would gain some kind of a reputation among the enemies. And a game could actually have a mechanic for this. So you could have the reputation of the player character affect the enemy morale. So if you play in a style that you slaughter hundreds of enemies, then your next enemies, who already have heard of you, or what's going on at least, might be kind of scared of you, and they might try to keep their distance, prefer to use snipers, for example, and run away, and all sorts of realistic things that people might actually do in a situation like that. And if you have been playing in a different style, avoiding, evading enemies whenever possible, killing none or very few of them, for example, then maybe your enemies would become overly confident, for example, and you could easily lure them into traps or ambushes or things like that, when they would be just running after you whenever given the opportunity. That's just an idea. Of course, it would make it a bit more difficult to design the game, but again, it would make the game better, so why not give it a go? These are my suggestions this time. If I come up with other suggestions, I'll make another video about them, but next time I make videos about game design, it will be about designing role-playing games for computers or for tabletop. I also created a playlist, so all of these videos about game design and tips for game masters, things like that, will be in that playlist if you prefer that way of using YouTube. That's all for now, I suppose. Bye! If you wish to support my channel, please click thumbs up, subscribe and share my videos. Any comments on the videos would also be welcome.